So let's pick up there, because it is the word of the moment, electrification, and it's something that we've been taking a keen interest in here in Australia. We had this idea that we might have you all down to Adelaide in November this year. Didn't quite pan out that way. It was someone, Turkey sort of came in and claimed the prize, but we still have this role as president of the negotiations. I know you're catching up with Minister Bowen next week. And both President Groom and Minister Bowen, the president of COP31, have been making more and more comments over the last few weeks about how they want to make electrification like a really central pillar of the COP31. Really just picking up this zeitgeist. I think that would have happened anyway. But then there's this extra forcing mechanism of the global fuel crisis, really resident of and redolent of the experience in the 1970s, and the way that those challenges kind of really drove policy making, but also investment decisions for many years to come. So can you just unpack a little bit more of those comments about what you're hearing around the world in terms of the literacy that's building around electrification, and how you think particularly governments but also industry are going to actually take that recognition and actually operationalise it, do things differently over the next few years?
So I think the key kind of graphic is encleanification versus electrification. But I think people have woken up to the fact that going that way gets gets more and more expensive, and that they've actually failed to go that way. But that is leaving the majority of economies with no pathway towards net zero or towards lower carbon. So that's one conversation that people are having. But there's another one which I'm trying to also push very hard. I hinted at it, but I didn't really go into depth in my remarks, which is that there's also a lot of conversation about the price of electricity. And I've recorded an episode with leader of the opposition, not leader of the opposition, the Shadow Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, and we were slugging it out in the UK, slugging it out over the cost of electricity. How can you electrify if, like Europe, and we saw, if electricity is expensive, why would anybody electrify? And why would anybody in South Australia buy a heat pump or an EV if it's just going to drive up their costs? And I think, so the thing that I'm trying to get into the conversation is that electrification is the answer to the costs. So because more and more of the costs of the grid are fixed. It's transmission, it's distribution grids, it's synchronous condensers, it's batteries, it's these big, it's fixed cost. And the way you lower fixed costs, or you lower the contribution, is get a bigger denominator. Right? When we made more telephone calls, we got cheaper telephone calls. And so electrification is hard if your costs are high, but then what we're looking for, what we want to do, is get a spiral, we're in a spiral of doom in Europe, where electricity gets more expensive, nobody wants to electrify, but there is also a virtuous circle. If you look at China, they first got onto that electrification track using dirty electricity, right, coal electricity, but now it's much easier for them to electrify. So their vehicles are 50-60% electric, and I was going to say nobody's complaining, but of course they're not complaining because they can't. But the model of just going cleaner and cleaner and driving up the costs, there's more and more understanding that that's not that that's bad. And let me just say that the difficulty for the policymakers is, if you mandate a coal retirement or you push this much renewables into the system, you can kind of measure that and it all feels good and you can tick the box. Whereas where we are now with the electrification is much harder, because you are now expecting people to change their behaviours, different types of heating, different types of vehicles, different types of ovens in your local bakery, etc. And it's much harder to do politically, and that's why there's a kind of comfort zone, which is, it's much easier to go and talk to Osgrid and Mark England about what he's doing and doing a sandbox with a battery and it's all very controllable and nice, versus having to have a discussion with the good people of New South Wales about actually they shouldn't just buy another diesel or another petrol car, and getting all of the blowback that will happen from that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, one way that conversation around, I guess, total system cost and the cost of services delivered manifests itself in an Australian context is talking about distribution network utilisation. So the idea, if we can grow utilisation of those distribution networks faster than we grow peak demand, and that's about how and where and when we use energy, it's smart energy use, smart electrification, then we're actually delivering those services a lot cheaper overall and bringing down costs for all consumers, actually, whether you're electrifying or not.
That's absolutely the right conversation, because the cost of these fixed costs, the network costs, they grow with the peak.
Yeah.
And so if you can double demand but only push up your peak by 50%, you've got a 25% reduction in those fixed costs.
Yeah.
Whereas if all you do is invest enormously in distribution and transmission and so on and so on and so on, and then you don't get the demand growth. And by the way, when I first came to Australia, which was, when I was doing New Energy Finance, when I first came to New Energy Finance, probably 2008, 9, and 10 and 11 and 12, AEMO kept on forecasting demand growth, and they were investing in poles and wires, and the demand growth was not materialising, and there was outrage over the costs correctly. So you need to drive the demand growth, electrify, and you need to make it smart so it doesn't push up the peak. And you need to do it, yes, if you're going to do it at the distribution level, if that's the focus, fine, but really it needs to be across the system. And by the way, that's one of the other things that happens with AI that we'll talk about, and I talk about AI data centers. Well, there isn't nearly enough focus on how can AI help with that pushing up demand, but not at the peak, in terms of whether it's enabling better tariff structures or more flexible time of use pricing or locational pricing, or lowering the cost of electrifying whatever new chunk of demand. But also managing the grid and managing the resources and managing the homes so that you push it away from those peaks. The average piece of transmission or distribution infrastructure is used 30%, 40% of the time, and we could get a lot more just by digitizing and being really smart about how we use those resources. Just look at the batteries that you're now installing, right? How are they being managed? Who's managing them? Because let me tell you, if AI can beat humans at chess and at Go, then AI can beat humans at managing when you use batteries or when you switch them in and out and do other things on the grid. And we're not hearing nearly enough about why are we doing AI in the energy system in the first place.
Yeah. So there's a few things to unpack there. Like in terms of the AI of it all, it's also about managing AI infrastructure as fleets across the system, because one of the things that you can do if you're thinking about AI is not just an individual flexible asset, but where those loads are being distributed across a fleet of AIs. But then going back to the conversation that you were starting to unpack around millions of decision makers that need to make different types of decisions, both at the point of purchase, but also in terms of how they're using those assets. On the point of purchase piece of it, interested in your thoughts on the degree to which in the UK there was a decision to kind of like set a deadline for when you would stop selling internal combustion engines. And there's a bit of bifurcation in terms of the way that different governments in Australia are approaching similar conversations. There's been a decision in Victoria to phase out hot water systems that are powered by gas and just say, look, we're just not selling them anymore, versus providing incentives or explaining the benefits. Like, to what degree do you think, in terms of shifting these markets, it's useful just to say we're not selling this stuff anymore?
I think there's a change, and I think I've changed my perspective on that, because saying we're going to switch off analog bandwidth in whatever it was that we did that meant that a lot of people just went out and bought digital radios and so on. So that model kind of worked, and of course there were people at the end who needed help, because they just were overwhelmed and needed help to switch over. And so initially I was thinking, okay, if we have a date when you just can't buy a diesel or a petrol car, then that's helpful. The problem is it just goes through into the political process and it gets an absolutely virulent pushback. It's held up, and I'm a conservative, small c, maybe still large c, but probably not. I don't know. We'll see. But I don't like banning things. I just think we should be able to encourage people. I had a fireside chat with Ernie Moniz, who was the second Barack Obama Secretary of Energy, and I asked him this question about, it seems like you need carrots and you need sticks to accelerate the process towards clean energy. What is the balance of carrots and sticks in the Department of Energy under your leadership as Secretary Moniz? And he said, under my leadership, we are a carrot-based department. And I thought that really, and I think he's probably right, that carrots are probably, but I think maybe there's a way of sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, to be a bit Hegelian about it. Maybe what you need to do is to say, we're going to ban these things, but never actually ban them. Right? Because you want people to feel that they are going to have to make the jump at some point, because then they invest the time in learning and maybe saving up or whatever they need to do.
Well, from a government perspective, if you can, the politics is vexed, but one of the great things about saying something, that you're going to be doing something or something's going away, is you just drive a lot of decision making without ever needing to spend any money. It's like people start to get signals, right?
So there's something that you're touching on there that's really important, which is, if you look at the cost of the transition, it really matters whether you replace assets at the end of their life or during their life.
Yes.
And you've got the great sort of blessing that your coal-fired power stations are ancient. If you look at other countries where they've got a much younger fleet, they would have a different set of decisions. So I think that we don't focus policy nearly enough. Instead of saying we'll ban the car, in 2030, the internal combustion, how about really thinking through, when somebody buys a new car, what are the things that could influence them at that point to make sure that it was an electric car, and really timing it for, and also not just in policy making, kind of wokeocracy type policy making, but also, for instance, getting individuals to say, I'll never buy another burner.
Yeah.
I'll pledge, I will never buy another burner. So if the kids are giving you a hard time, why are we still driving a petrol? You just say, don't worry, I've signed the pledge, we'll never buy another burner. Not a boiler, not a car, not a gas oven in my bakery that I run, whatever it is that, and because, if we just did that, again, there would be a transition. Because, by the way, coming back to the little diagram, the blue thing that grows, the transition that is happening versus the one that isn't, please, it's not that it happens automatically. There's a lot of effort required because, policymakers, investors, business owners, individuals need to be thinking, how do I make sure that I keep going 5% per year, every year, forever? So there's a lot of interventions needed, but focusing those interventions on asset replacement point, because once you've bought the wrong asset, there's very little you can do. If you've got that car, you're using that car.
Yes.
So the key point is the asset purchase point, and I think we need to focus. Our policy needs to be a much more shaped charge.
Yeah. I'm going to throw it open to the floor. So if there's any questions for Michael, just put your hand up. And James was wandering around with the microphone. Anyone brave enough to?
There's one over there.
One here and one up the back. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the engaging conversation. My name's Alina Dini. I'm Head of Energy and Infrastructure at the Electric Vehicle Council. My question is, you just made a really awesome point, I thought, which is the asset purchase is so important to this transition. And I've dedicated a lot of my time looking at the purchase process, particularly for electric vehicles, but I think it applies to all clean energy. And my question is, we don't really value consumer education. We don't really want to fund it. I think policymakers overlook it as an opportunity for massive intervention. So my question is, what can be done to encourage better interventions in the purchase process, which we know will lead to better outcomes for electrification?
I think it's a great question, because what you're looking for is a sort of acupuncture point. So how can you improve the purchase? And I am 100% with you that an improvement is needed. And that goes back to all the things that I've done as an entrepreneur building businesses. User interface really matters. And sometimes we think that there's an example in electric cars, which is not the purchase process, but we obsess with range and battery size and maybe a little bit of acceleration, whatever. But the fact is, we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about the software. So I've got a VW ID4, and every time I try and park it, when it sees another car and I get within it slams the brakes on, and then it does this lane assist thing, and I have to turn off the lane assist. Every time I drive the car, I have to turn off the lane assist, and every time it's back on. And amazingly, every time I drive the car, I have to put it into eco mode, and every time I stop and buy a Kit Kat or a pint of milk and get back in the car, it's turned it back and it's not in eco mode anymore. And you just think, this is bonkers. So there they are worrying about the battery and the range, and they're not worrying about the software, and they're not worrying about the purchase process. So I don't have any quick things, but I do think that sitting down and debugging that process and asking what happens when somebody... Can I give you an example? I'm not going to answer your question because I don't know the purchase process, but I'll give you an example from boilers and heat pumps. In the UK, and I'm sure it's not different here where people are using heating, 90% of purchases of boilers happen when the old boiler breaks. And your house is cold, you've got no hot water, you've got kids to get to school, you've got to get to work, etc., etc. So you just call up a plumber, you say, I'm thinking of getting a heat pump. They're like, well, I'll have to come around and do a heat loss measurement. And you're like, well, I'm cold, and the kids haven't had a shower and so on. So forget it, we'll just put another boiler in. So what I've been pushing in the UK is saying, think about what does a heat pump ready program look like, where you do that work beforehand. Maybe you give somebody 50 quid if they have a certificate saying they're heat pump ready. They've thought about it, they know what heat pump they're going to buy, they know which supplier they're going to use, they have a plan, and when the boiler breaks, they pull the plan out of the drawer and they execute it. Maybe there's some of the rooms that can't be heated with a heat pump because the radiator's not big enough. Maybe they fix that beforehand. So you can change the purchase process and get, but really attune it to that point and the stresses people are at the point when they're making the purchase. So I don't know how that translates into your world, but yes.
It's like it's doing the table setting, right? So that as you say, when you're at that point of the capital replacement cycle, true for households, maybe even more true for businesses as well, particularly if they process heat or things like that. There can be more complex kind of like transformations that they might need to do within their business. Having a plan for that, not waiting for something to break and then trying to work it out.
And for instance, I say, I like this idea of a pledge, never buy another burner, because if you were to say we're not going to buy another car, and the next one, a lot of people say, the next car will probably be electric, but do they know where they'll charge it? Do they know where they'll charge it when they go to the place they go on holiday? Do they know what model, or do they start researching early? Could they be encouraged to incentives, mentorship, or seeing, getting advice from somebody who's already made the journey, those sorts of things, yes.
All right, did we have another question?
Hello.
Yeah.
Monica Richter from Worldwide Fund for Nature.
Where are you? Where
I'm right at the back.
Oh, there you go. Right.
So I'm really what keeps me awake at night is thinking about Australia is one of the largest fossil fuel exporters in the world. We also have one of the least complex economies, less complex than the economy of Uganda. So, how do we actually help to drive the transition from being a fossil fuel exporter to being a clean energy exporter? There's a lot written on that. I guess I'd be really interested to know what messages you are going to be giving to Minister Bowen and some of the other meetings that you have about accelerating, fast-tracking, the future made in Australia with our Asian trading partners. But I'd be really interested if you've got some comments and views on that. Thank you.
So I think your coal exports will over, the next, let's call it, I don't know how long, but, over a decadal time frame, they will solve themselves. Because we are seeing a bit of a return to coal in Asia because of the price of gas driven by the Hormuz crisis. That price of gas will resolve pretty quickly, because what we've lost in terms of gas supply is not, people think it's 20% of oil and it's 20% of gas. It's not. It's 20% of oil and it's 20% of LNG, which is only 14% of gas. So actually, what's disappeared from the gas system is only 3%. And gas growth was almost stalled before. It only grew 0.5% in 2025, and there was a huge surplus of LNG about to hit the markets. So the gas prices are going to come down, but we are seeing a return to coal, because what's going to happen, I think, and I hope is going to happen, is that even if the gas prices come down, the LNG prices, that countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh and of course China and India and some of the big buyers, Japan and South Korea, I'd almost rather that they went back temporarily to coal and bought it from Australia, but accelerated their attempts to get clean electricity domestically, because that will spur a much more systematic change. But if they do go back to coal, they will go back to domestic coal, because they're doing it for resilience reasons. They're not going to go from dependence on LNG to a permanent, forever dependence on imported Australian coal. And we saw this, there's already been enormous changes in the destination of your coal from China and then a bit to India, and it's a very different market now. So I think that will solve itself over time as other economies go through the electrotech revolution. So I think you have the conversation about Australia's economy. You don't have to say climate change, because of climate change we have to destroy an export industry. I think personally I would frame it as, it's going to go away, how do you want the economy to work? And then you can have a much broader set of conversations, not just with Minister Bowen, but also with Angus Taylor and with others that you have to have somehow involved in this conversation. I had this conversation, I was on the UK Board of Trade with a certain Tony Abbott, and I had this conversation with him where his view going in, I think I'm going to paraphrase, was all of what we're talking about is threatening to Australia because we make our money selling coal, and what's happening is people like you are trying to destroy the prosperity of Australia. And I actually started to talk to him about lots of other things to do with trade and the fact that I'm actually, I'm actually politically on the centre right and so on. So I had lots of conversations, but eventually I got around to saying, but the transition is happening. This is what people are doing. And this was already back in 2021, 2022 sometime. It is happening, and you are going to lose those exports of coal, but we're going to need huge amounts of nickel and copper and all sorts of minerals. And what better place? And by the way, what better way, if there's going to be a transition, we have a choice. We can either buy that stuff from Indonesia and China, or from a country like Australia that the US and Europe and the UK and Canada feel much more comfortable becoming dependent for those minerals on. And actually, we did have some much, much, much better conversations, because suddenly it was, well, you're going to grow some other industries. And but it's complicated because you've still got that vast dominance of particularly smelting by China. They've been very intentional. They've built overcapacity. It's environmental dumping, because they don't care if the people working in those refining operations, if their health is damaged, and we can't do this without using the words forced labour. But if you don't want that, then you have to be prepared to do something about it, to demand higher quality, higher standards, to be prepared to pay a somewhat higher price for those minerals. And if you are, then you'll get a supply chain built here in Australia, and it will be able to export to other countries that are prepared to pay that premium. And I very much hope it goes that way. But we can't just pretend that we can do all of that and then undercut the China price. because you're not going to be able to.
Yeah, and that's the geopolitical lens on all of this, in terms of the security of supply chains. That we're going to be.
And you've got to talk resilience, and you've got to talk to the people who care most about resilience. It's got to be a broader political conversation than just a conversation with the already convinced, which is, I think, a little bit the danger.
Yeah. We've got time for one more question, I think, over here.
Yeah, hello, Jared Leake from the Australian Alliance for Energy Productivity, to the left, Michael. We love talking about electrification of process heat, but that requires cheaper electricity. The way we're going at the moment is not in that direction. Our regulator just increased potential revenue for our networks in Victoria by 30 to 50% over the next 5 years. Just want to hear your thoughts on best practice for grid utilisation. Who's doing the best? What's driving that in the right direction? Is that dollars of regulated asset base into total electrons moved, or just keen to hear your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've recorded an episode with Mark England, who's the CEO of Ausgrid, and I challenged him a little bit on, because he would like the distribution grids to play a bigger role, and they need to play a bigger role because the more you can balance between local demand and supply, then the more utilisation of the distribution grid, which is where a lot of investment has to go, and the more costly, the more cost effective it can be. But I challenged him on isn't he just in the business, or Ausgrid just in the business of investing? Because then the investment it can charge its regulated returns on, and so there's a disincentive for the things that you're talking about, which is just getting more utilisation, because the more you can invest, you don't care then about the utilisation. He gave very good answers, very considered answers, but fundamentally I think there's a mismatch. And I don't know the full set of regulatory responses. We have in the UK, there's a mechanism that rewards innovation, and I think I'm not able to say I don't know your regulatory book, how it works well enough. I would say that be very careful about what metrics you use, because energy productivity, sort of dollars of GDP versus amount of, is it primary energy we're talking? Or is it final energy? Or is it useful energy? Or is it exergy, engineer speaking? Because we mix these things up and we then regulate around them, and we discover that we've done something that's not smart. For instance, we talk about power to X. Power to X got a big thing, and you can talk about the efficiency of making a fuel out of electricity, but of course a fuel is much less useful than electricity. Electricity is pure ability to do work. You stick it in a car, you drive. So I don't know what your metrics are. I'd actually love to have a chat and learn more, but it's going to be in that detail that needs to be really well built in before pulling out and creating policy on top of it. So more engineers needed in policy making.
Here, here. Michael, you may have heard that Tony Abbott has just been elected unopposed as the president of the Federal Liberal Party.
I spoke to him about it yesterday.
Well, there you go. So I fully support you in your ongoing role as Tony Abbott whisperer. I think good idea.
I wouldn't go that far. We were on the Board of Trade under Liz Truss, who was a very good trade minister and then very not good at the things she did afterwards. And I stay in touch. But honestly, I do think we've got. This is a moment in time when genuinely resilience, cost, and climate can be aligned. And I don't know. We'll see whether I still agree with myself after the press club outing at Canberra in a few days' time.
Michael, good luck with the press club. Please put your hands together for Michael Liebreich. And we're going to break for half an hour. We'll be back here on this stage at 11 a.m.